Shalom, shalom, everybody. Ariel Tzadok here from the KosherTorah School, found online at www.KosherTorah.com. Tonight, it's actually not night yet, and that's going to become relevant in a minute, as you will see, maybe a little more than a minute. We are continuing in my series of lessons, which I have called the Torah Basics Plus. And a point that I made every class, when I say plus, I mean plus. Because my definition of basics and the definition of basics by others may not be the same. And we might add a little bit more than what other people do. Well, this is lesson 7 in this series. And we've discussed all kinds of spiritual and theoretical issues and others. But being that this is a class about Torah, needless to say, you're not going to be too far from, of course, Judaism. Now remember, I make a distinction between Judaism and Torah. How? Judaism is the religion of the Torah that is practiced by Torah faithful Jews, which unfortunately are still a minority amongst the known Jewish people today. Torah are the universal principles which come forth, and they are, needless to say, applicable because of their wisdom to everyone in the world. When it comes to study, you have various opinions expressed by numerous rabbinic sages over, millennia, about whether or not non-Jews should have access to study Torah. And you will find that the majority of those opinions will disagree on one point. Yes, absolutely, everyone should have access to the study of the universal principles. Some refer to this as the Sheva Mitzvot, the 7 commandments of the children of Noah, without realizing that those 7 are categories of expansion which include pretty much the majority of all of Orthodox Judaism today. And you even have specific rabbinic opinions who have expressed verbally and in writing that even Kabbalistic teachings should be made available to the non-Jewish audience with the intent to teach them about the true fear, awe, love of God and how to properly come close. So, with that being said, of course, it's in that light that we, of course, welcome here at our KosherTorah school anyone and everyone who wants to learn. I have classes in traditional Orthodox Judaism, topics of Gemara and halakha, for those of our students who are, of course, Torah observant Jews and who are obviously inclined, like I am, to learn these subjects. But not everybody's so inclined or interested. Others are interested in more universal stuff. So, all of this becomes very, very important for the topic of tonight's class, which is how Rabbinic Judaism evolved out of biblical Judaism. Now, yes, it is an evolutionary process, and don't go bending yourselves out of shape with the concept of evolution. One of my books is called The Evolution of God, because that word evolution means a directed process of transformation of form from simpler to more complex. That's how I define evolution. I'm not going to get into it with Mr. Darwin or anything of the kind. Do I believe that that's the way that life on Earth possibly developed? It's possible. Because when we learn in the Kabbalah what's called the order of divine manifestations, the Hishtalshelut, which is what the subject of my book, Evolution of God, is all about. We begin with the ultimate simplicity of the Ein Sof. We materialize the unmanifest Adam Kadmon, and then using significantly subjective metaphors. We speak of the ears and the nose and the mouth, lights coming forth from the ears, the nose, the mouth of Adam Kadmon, then the light of his eyes coming forth from beneath his beard. to a place in the chest where the vessels are not properly aligned, and then there's the shattering of the vessels, which then leads to a realignment and a tikkun. And we speak about this in the concept of 3 evolving worlds called the Akodim, Nikudim, and Birudim. So this is what you can correctly call the evolution, if you will, of God. And that is the context of my using that term in the title of my book. Now, as this process of development occurs, so this process of development occurred within the Torah observance, which is Judaism. The way that Moses and the community in those days practiced Judaism is significantly different from how we practice it today. That should be a no-brainer. But at the same time, the continuity, what we call the Mesorah in Hebrew, the links of the chain, are tight, strong, absolute. So yeah, there is a evolution, like a child being born. And when that child is a newborn, right, in the arms of its mummy, compared to when it's an old, ornery old coot like me, it's come a long way. But it's the same. But if you took a look at pictures of me when I was 2 and 3 years old with, believe it or not, my platinum blonde hair, back in the 60s and stuff like that. Well, in the words of the old Virginia Slims cigarette commercial, you've come a long way, baby, to get to where you've got to today. How many of you remember cigarette commercials? Dating myself. Evolution. That's the way I use the term. Judaism has evolved in the same way. And this is a very important evolution, which I believe is even hinted to in the Torah itself. So you have pretty much today what we call Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism, I remember the Marlboro Man too, right? With the old theme song from the Magnificent Seven, the original one. But, not getting sidetracked, the Judaism that we observe today, Rabbinic Judaism, evolved out of the biblical traditions. And, as I said, I believe this is even hinted to in the Torah itself. When I was preparing this class to compare biblical and Rabbinic Judaism, I always speak about that little still, soft voice that just pops into my head. Well, I remembered the verse, the pasuk, that Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, said at Mount Sinai. They said something very curious when God gave them the Torah. They said in Hebrew, Na'aseh v'nishma. Curious order of terminology. We will do, Na'aseh, and only afterwards does it say ve and nishma. We will hear. Question. How do you do something if you don't know how to do it? Well, isn't that a good statement, a good question? Look at the times of the Bible, biblical Judaism. Look at the times of the rabbis, Rabbinic Judaism. And I see in those two words, Na'aseh v'nishma, a prophecy of the evolution of the history of Torah and Judaism. And I'll tell you how. Pretty much during biblical times, if and when there is a question of what to do and how to do it. For example, we find in the Bible, Moses commands the children of Israel, you will observe the Sabbath. Remember one of the 10 commandments? And you violate the Sabbath, capital punishment. So I don't know about you, but I'm really not too keen to face capital punishment, especially for doing something that I didn't know was wrong. So, if I hear Moses say that the one who violates the Sabbath shall be put to death, I don't know about you, but I would be the one in the back of the crowd raising my hand and say, Moses, Rabbeinu, what exactly are the things that we're prohibited to do so we don't, violate the law? And Moses would say, this is God's law, not mine. I don't make this stuff up. So I'll go ask God. God speaks to Moses. Moses tells us. And we have the genesis of what we call the oral Torah. And without that oral Torah, none of what we observe today could ever be known or practiced. It's very important to understand the logic of there being an oral Torah. Now, a point that our rabbis have made over many, many, many centuries is that which we call Torah me Moshe me Sinai, the original, authentic, historical Torah from those days, and what we observe today in Rabbinic Judaism, we call them both oral Torah, but it's not historically the same. And that's very, very important, because the rabbis have always been very emphatic to emphasize the difference between what we call a halakha, a law, deoraita, from the Torah, written or oral, no difference, and a halakha derabanan, a law of the sages. Now, this is where we get into na'aseh v'nishma, because after the days of Moses, when there was a question that arose, they would go to the high priest, or to the judge, or to the prophet, who was in those days Joshua, the judges, Samuel, and the later prophets, Natan and the like, Achia HaShiloni, Eliyahu HaNavi, later, of course, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all down through the many centuries. Now, the prophets, for the most part, were also Kohanim, and it was in the hands of the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, who had the obligation, the responsibility to teach the people Torah. So you would have wandering Kohanim who were not serving in the Holy Temple, the Levites as well, and they would have their own little cities, and they went throughout ancient Israel, biblical Israel, the days like David, Solomon, and the like, and they would teach people orally what to do and how to do it. And that is how the Torah was taught in those days. Yes, dear. You know you're disturbing, class. What do you want? Sierra is here. I got to give her one of her little snackums. You see, this is part of oral Torah. When you know there's a need here, you got to provide for it. There you go, sweetheart. Go, knock yourself out. Some will say, "Oh, that's such a horrible thing to be distracted." You know, baloney. Because when we talk about na'aseh v'nishma, you have an obligation and a responsibility. Okay, that soul, which is right now in the body of a canine, I am blessed by heaven to have in my care. And if she feels the need to come in the middle of class, no, I can't move the camera to show you, Sierra. If she feels the need to come here, she's at her dinner, but she's a spoiled little girl. I wonder who spoils her, huh? And so I have her little snacks here so she could chew on them. Yeah. Did anybody ever not know that I'm a dog person? Okay, yeah. All righty. enough of my, I call her my canine daughter, and people who don't like that, too bad. What can I say? But in the biblical days, when there was a question, you went to the prophet, the Kohen, and they would respond to you in a very simple way, like you read in the Bible. Ko amar Hashem, thus saith the Lord. When Moses brought down oral Torah, same thing. So, biblical Judaism was built upon that first part of that phrase, na'aseh v'nishma. Na'aseh. When the prophet speaks, na'aseh, we will do. That's great. That's obedience. That's the way it's supposed to be. Dramatic pause here because times changed. The original Israelite culture was an agrarian, non-urban, rural society, like in the desert stuff. Once the children of Israel started building cities and wanted a centralized government, remember from how Samuel brought prophecy from God. Oh, you want a king? A human king, what? The divine king's not good enough for you? It's considered a rebellion against God. And ever since we had an urbanization process and a centralized government, everything went downhill from there. It led to all the corruption and the disalignment, whatever, that caused the Ark of the Covenant to have to be disconnected, turned off. The Urim and Tumim, right? The whole system was put into concealment. Na'aseh, no more. No more after the final prophets, after the Babylonian exile. No more did a prophet speak to the children of Israel. Excuse me for a second. And that was a prophecy. The prophet said there would be a time when there would be a famine in the land. Not for food and water, but for the word of God. And that happened. What do you do? What do you do when there's no one to go to anymore to ask what to do and you just follow? You're lost. You're lost. And then what happens next? The people got together. You read about this in the book of Malachi. Right? The sages got together, those who call upon God. They said, no, we're not going to accept this. If God doesn't want to speak to us, God doesn't want to come to us, we're going to go to God. Right? You know the old saying, if Moshe doesn't come to the mountain comes to Moshe. Well, however, we're going to apply that metaphor. The people decided that they needed to take the steps. And of course, this developed into the Ruah HaKodesh, the spiritual ascent paths of the Maaseh Merkavah, the Hechalot school, the prophetic Kabbalah, which is what is practiced to this day, right here at the KosherTorah school. But something else happened during this time. A very curious overlapping of culture and history. The old Torah Hebraic mindset was being compromised, first by the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian cultures, which we see clearly their influence in the later books of the Bible. But then, in around the 3rd century before the Common Era, along came the Greeks. And the Greeks brought with them, remember, these are the students of Aristotle, the students of Plato, the students of Socrates. Now, they very well also knew spiritual stuff. And at the same time, they cultivated and developed the rational intellect. Not everybody in Greece sought to go to the oracles of Delphi to hear what the gods had to say. People like Socrates, and of course Plato, Aristotle. They said, no, you got to use your mind, you got to think. Well, there arose in the tradition of the prophets and the priests and the Levites, even laymen, who came to study the words of the Torah, to understand them, to apply to them the understanding of the intellect, and therefore would use that intellect to ascertain from the words of Torah that God already gave us what is the way of God and how we are supposed to approach God. And this was the birth of what we today call halakha. Now, of course, we have the written law, and of course, we have the oral traditions that were passed down through the centuries, from the priests and the Levites to these original teachers of the Torah. And who are they? You can read the history of the leaders of the genesis of these groups right in the Pirkei Avot, in the first chapter there. And this is how the Nishma portion of Torah developed. God no longer spoke directly to tell us what to do. Pause. So we had to learn how to figure it out ourselves. That's how Rabbinic Judaism began. Now, some would say, well, that's terrible. That's such a lower level. Baloney. But anybody who knows and understands the order of what we call the Sephirotic tree of life and the secrets of the Kabbalah, this was not a step down. Au contraire, this was a step up. Big time. How? I'll give you the example that is often used written in the book of the Baal Shem Tov. When a child, little baby, remember like I used to be, was in the hands of mommy, mommy would give me everything. She would feed me, she would clothe me, she'd change my diapers, and I'd go wow, 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 and mommy would take good care of me. But then came a time I had to learn from not crawling but how to walk. And daddy would stand me up to walk. I'd take 2-3 steps, fall, get up, walk again. Eventually, I learned how to walk. And then, eventually, I learned how to run. And God bless, we will all learn one day how to fly. This is why Rabbinic Judaism developed, because this was the divine way of allowing, enabling, encouraging, forcing the children of Israel to grow up spiritually. We didn't need the nurturing path of our spiritual infancy. We were maturing and we grew beyond this. And you read in the history of the days of the Second Temple how anyone who wanted to rise up and join this group was welcome to do so. And indeed, from all different walks of life came many different people, including those who were not Jewish, who decided to embrace the Torah path and to walk it, embrace it fully, and became what we call Gerei Tzedek. Believe it or not, even some who had ancestry of a very dubious nature, according to our sages, some of the ancestors, some of the descendants of people like Haman, the good old Nazi Haman, right? Eventually converted and became Jewish rabbis. Yeah. So this was a maturation process, wherein which that which we knew because we had it by rote, now we could expand the powers of our minds. And according to the Kabbalah, this is what we call the development from Chokhmah to Bina. Sechel Tenudah, as we call it in the prophetic Kabbalah. The union of intuition and intellect. Now, especially in our meditative traditions, this is of vital importance. Because you can have a dream, and you see all kinds of weird, cool visions and stuff in the dreams, and if you don't know what it means, then you're missing the point. Many people have visions and dreams, and because they don't have enough rational intellect to understand them, they misunderstand them, try to, or look at them literally, and completely pervert the message thereof, because they weren't well trained. Yes, the dangers of false prophecy existed in the days of the First Temple, and the dangers of false interpretations of the Torah exist to this very day. And that is always a problem that plagues us. So let's talk about that. You see, how and what do we then define and decide what is authentic Torah Judaism? Who gets to decide? You? Me? At one time in the days when the temple stood, and for a while afterwards, we had a general court, a supreme court, which decided these things. You're all familiar with it. We called it the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin eventually just became obsolete because Jewish communities were spread so far and wide, from the farthest reaches in the west in Spain to the furthest reaches in the east beyond Persia and even in India and even in China. And all of these communities had different needs, experiences, cultures, and everything else. Let's not forget the communities in Africa, amongst other places. And this therefore developed that each and every community had to understand the nature of Torah within a context which was applicable personally. So, this began the development of what we today call the minhag, or the tradition. Now, certain minhagim, traditions, of individual communities, we know the big famous communities. Those of Eastern Europe were called Ashkenazim. Those originating in Spain were called Sephardim. Those originating in certain Arabic countries are called Edot Mizrach, communities of the East, Yemenite tradition, amongst others. Many of these communities had very unique and different needs and stuff, and they're developed unique expressions based upon a common denominator. And that, of course, was the compilation of the teachings. Everybody has heard of the famous Talmud. And the Talmud, you have to remember, the Talmud is not a book. It is an encyclopedia. It is a history of over 1,000 years of ideas, beliefs, practices, superstitions, and the like. If you want to look into Talmud, you're going to pretty much find everything, good and bad and ugly as it goes. Now, some people not well educated today think that absolutely every word in the Talmud is real and right as it's literally. No rabbis ever taught that. All right? The Talmud needs to be studied, not read. You have to understand the ways and nature and the ebb and flow, because the rabbis, over the many centuries, who are debating these laws of how to do things, creating minhagim and the like, creating laws for and of the Torah. Where on earth they get the authority to do this? Well, actually, it's a biblical verse in Deuteronomy. When you have a case of law which is too difficult, you should go to the priest, the Levite, or to the judge who shall be in those days. And they decide, and you better listen. That's the law. In that respect, over the many centuries, rabbis have debated and argued and discussed many a law. And that is what the codification of the Talmud is all about. Now, when you read the Talmud, it is not a code of law. No one turns to the Talmud for what we call a halakha, a law. That's actually a quote from the Gemara itself, from the Talmud itself, from Tractate Nida. It says, Eno lomdim halakha mipi Gemara. The Gemara, which is the teaching of the Talmud, is specifically designed to train the mind in Na'aseh v'nishma, Chochmah and Binah. And all those who are properly trained in Talmudic understanding are able to apply what we call in the prophetic Kabbalah the Sechel to Nuda, going back from Binah to Chochmah, Chochmah to Binah, going back from the rational into the intuitive, from the intuitive back to the rational. So for anyone who's ever studied Talmud, you will notice that it will be in the middle of a very picayune discussion of the application of a law. Somebody will throw in a comment from left field. And remember, this is edited stuff, so it's not like this happened organically. It's edited work. They intentionally put those comments in there as they did. And all of a sudden they digress to discuss stuff. I'll give you an example. In the Gemara, a tractate called Baba Batra, Daf Yud Bet Amud Aleph, there is a discussion about the orientation of some real estate and portions and parcels and the like. And one opinion comes across and says, this is the way it's supposed to be. Now, the writing of this material presents that as, what the heck? Where did that come from? Whose opinion is that? They said, sounds like prophecy, like it just came out of heaven. And this then opened up a discussion about the nature of intellectual analysis versus intuitive reception. And the question is asked, which is better, a prophet or a sage? A rabbi. Which is better, divine revelation or intellectual analysis? The Gemara there says something very profound. It says, from the time that prophecy ceased in Israel, it says prophecy was taken away from the prophets and given to the sages. Prophecy given to the sages? I challenge all my peers and everyone else, show me one rabbi in the history of rabbis, from way back when, in the days of Ezra HaSofer himself, one rabbi, other than maybe a biblical prophet, who would ever say the halakha is ko amar Hashem, the Lord says that this is, that. We make emphatic denial of that type of persuasion in law. There's a very famous story in Baba Metzia, an argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua and the sages with regards to the kosher status of a certain kind of an oven. Now, according to the idea and understanding of the law, this oven was technically kosher by all means. And that was the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer expressed the opinion, hey, if it's kosher, then just let's make it kosher. But the rabbis, led by Rabbi Yoshua, said, something's not right here. We suspect there's going to be a problem. Because even though this oven is technically kosher, somehow, some way, its appearance is such like an unkosher oven that if we permit it, it's going to lead to all kinds of problems and confusion. So we're going to forbid it. And Rabbi Eliezer says, no, you can't do that. And I call heaven and earth to verify that I'm telling you the truth. And all kinds of miracles happened, weird stuff happened. And every time, Rabbi Yoshua says, we don't learn from miracles. I don't care about miracles. In frustration, Rabbi Eliezer looks up to heaven and calls on God. He says, will heaven please come to my aid? A voice speaks down what everyone in the yeshiva heard from heaven saying, why do you argue with Rabbi Eliezer when you know the laws like him? Whoa! Prophecy? God speaks, or the angel, whoever it was. Rabbi Yoshua stands up, respect to the holy voice of God, says, in the Torah, it is written that the Torah is not in heaven. The Torah is on earth. In the Torah, it says, you shall go to the judges who shall be in those days, and what they decide we will do. And therefore, we, the judges of these days, we decide. And we say this oven is not kosher, period. Thank you. Ho, 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 ho! Rabbi Yoshua pretty much just told heaven where to go. Someone said, that's arrogant, blasphemy. On the contrary, au contraire. The story continues. One of the sages who was there, witnessed this, later met the immortal prophet Eliyahu Hanavi. And he says, Eliyahu, Master Eliyahu, what was going on in heaven? Was God like going to throw a lightning bolt and kill Rabbi Yoshua and the sages? And they says, oh no, on the contrary. God was proud of them. Beni nitzahoni, he said. My sons have defeated me. They were right. That's what God wanted to happen. That Rabbi Yoshua, instead of being like a little infant child, say, oh, whatever daddy says. No, he stood up and said, this is what's right, and we're going to stand by it. And God said, that's right, my son. Now you're walking tall. Erich Fromm, very famous psychoanalyst, and his book, Shall Be As Gods, his commentary on Judaism, says this is the essence of Torah. Freedom. And that is what Torah is all about. Freedom, maturity, responsibility. Responsibility? Yes, dear. Are you still hungry? Yeah, I wish I could take the camera. You want to come up here and say hi? Oh, she's here pointing at the snacks on my desk. She's... You know something? Yeah. I'm such a pushover. I spoil her. Yeah. Go. There you go. She's hungry. I'm going to have to give her another can of food later. But okay. This is not a distraction. This is the application of halakha. Because you have the obligation to take care of your animals. And even though we're having our chat, and she has her needs, she's of a lower consciousness. She doesn't understand that we're having a chat. She just understands her needs. I have to understand her needs. And I have to weigh the needs of someone who doesn't understand to the needs of those of you who do understand. So I can explain to you what I'm doing. I can't explain that to a lower consciousness of an animal. So I don't believe in anything as a distraction. I believe everything is synchronistic. So this is actually a learning point, because we must understand rationally, when we have a need, we have to be responsible to fulfill that need. Rabbi Yoshua understood the need to be responsible to the communities of Israel, and therefore made his law accordingly. Another very famous example. In the days of the Mishnah, you had Rabbi Yehuda, famous prince who ordained, put together the Mishnah, the original codification of our oral traditions. And in it, the law was stated that chicken, which is not meat, should be considered to be meat in all respects, because, like meat, the chicken needs to be slaughtered. It needs to have its blood removed. And if you could have some kind of food that has to be slaughtered and its blood removed, you might, and that could be eaten with dairy, you might confuse to think meat could be eaten with dairy. So therefore, they made the rule that chicken should always be considered like meat. But one of the great sages of the day, Rabbi Yossi of the Galil, says, my communities, we did not accept Rabbi Yehuda's opinion on that. And to the day he died, they still had chicken parmesan. What can I say? We don't do that today. Why? Because we follow the sages. Remember we talked about that word minhag? You have minhagim, which are subjective to a community. And then you have certain minhagim, which have been adopted by and embraced by everyone, such as the 7 clean days of Nidah. And as such, we have a statement, minhag b'Yisrael Torahi. A minhag that's been adopted by everyone is the halakha. That's the Torah. That's the way we do things. And we don't rock the boat. So this is how we understand these things. And how did our rabbis come to all these conclusions? Rabbi Yoshua had the courage to stand up to God. Something deep inside them told them. And that something deep inside was that na'aseh. That na'aseh, which comes before nishma, is that what we call Ruah HaKodesh, divine inspiration. Their consciousness was so calibrated with the focus of God, which is what God wanted us to learn. We didn't have to just feed us. We had to learn to stand up and feed ourselves. God helps those who help themselves. That wise prophet, I say that facetiously, Benjamin Franklin said that. That's the Torah attitude. God wanted us to grow up. And because we embraced the rational intellect, along with the psychic intuitive, that was Ruah HaKodesh. And that is what connected the links of the chain throughout the centuries to create what we again call this Masorah. So when the rabbis put together the Talmud, right, Rav Ashi, Ravina, they had that instinct, that intuition, that knew very well how to weave together this wonderful encyclopedia of knowledge. And that those who can look at it and gaze upon the waves of flowing logic and intuition would be able to understand the vibrant breath of the secrets of the Torah. So, I've long been asked, what do I consider to be the greatest Kabbalistic text? No, I don't think it's the Zohar. On the contrary, I think the greatest Kabbalistic text of all, is the Talmud. Because when you study it in the proper ebb and flow of things, you will see and understand the true secrets of the Torah, recognizing the Ruah HaKodesh and what I call psychic Judaism. You will recognize how the way of God, the halakha, evolved and developed like the links of a chain flowing forth. And this is how all of this continues. Now, when we come to halakha, remember Jewish law, like I said, over the many centuries, you have all different kinds of views and opinions on everything. And that's just the way it is. I hear the pitter-patter of little doggy feet. Are you coming back for another snack? Here you go. See, I had it out because I knew you were coming. Love it. Never a distraction, a fulfillment of responsibility. That's what we rabbis have to do. We have to recognize the need of the moment and fulfill it. That's why we're here. That's exactly what the message is. So whether you were living in Northern Europe or Southern Spain, your circumstances were different. Your perception of life was different. So when you came and studied the common denominator of the Talmud, and you said, gee, how do we apply this or that law in our environment? This is what led to different rabbinic opinions over many, many centuries. These rabbis were collectively called the Rishonim, or the early rabbis. And amongst them you had very famous teachers, of course, like Maimonides in Egypt, who represented a specific orientation, philosophy of law, as compared to and different from Rabbeinu Asher, who was in Spain, who had a different view of things and a completely different orientation of writing and commentary. Prior to them both, there was a very famous rabbi, Rabbeinu Nissim, who wrote from Morocco. And these great rabbis each provided literature with their own opinions and views and understandings of how to apply these different things. And how and what are we supposed to follow? Because every community had its own great rabbis and sages. Of course, we're very familiar with biblical commentators from northern France, like, actually southern France, I think, Rashi, right? And of course, his grandson was a member of a group of rabbis who were Talmudic commentators called the Tosfot. So you have all of these different views and opinions. And when you read the opinions, they're all different from one another. Some of them are outright contradictory. Some are even hostile to one another. And yet our rabbis say something so weird. They say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim ha'im. These and these are the words of the living God. How can contradictory and even hostile views both be coming from the Lord? Well, when you're thinking in that little childlike mythology that God said this and that, no. But Ruah HaKodesh, the divine inspiration, brings to us insights from the quantum reality, psychic Judaism, and lets us realize that there are multiple different facets to everything. You can look at a single practice in Judaism. I'll give you a very practical one. God bless God, I pray. We all brush our teeth. We all know what it's like to brush our teeth. However, on the Sabbath, wherein which specific activities are prohibited, the act of brushing the teeth can become problematic. It's possible that you could brush your teeth and scrape your gums, causing yourself to bleed, which would be a prohibited act on the Sabbath. You have all kinds of questions. And so the question arises in modern day. Is it permissible for one to brush one's teeth on the Sabbath? Well, you may or may not be surprised to know that there are those opinions on one side that say, no, it's absolutely forbidden to brush your teeth on the Sabbath. And there are those opinions that, yes, you can, but not with toothpaste. Then there are those opinions that say, yes, you can brush your teeth even with toothpaste. There are those who say absolutely no, and there are those who will say absolutely yes. And they're all divinely inspired? Yes. If you can get to the bottom of it in wisdom. So, back to that Gemara in Baba Batra, where they said that the spirit of prophecy left the prophets and went to the sages. Well, curious thing they also said there, prophecy also went to, crazy people, right? And that's interesting. Rabbis and sages and crazy people are all considered like the same. Well, you never know, especially rabbis like me. They're definitely crazy. Ask the Rabbinic, she'll tell you. But anyway, on a serious note, In the Baba Batra there, it says something very profound. And this is very important. Hacham adif min navi. A sage is preferable over a prophet. Because if you are a prophet, you got to wait for God to come to you. If you are a sage, you go to God on your own. You get the answer, and you're able to bring it down. You don't wait for it to come down. You go up. The secret of Maaseh Merkavah. The secret of Hechalot. So it's all there. Hacham adif min navi. But there's a problem, like I said, with regards to dreams. When you're in the meditative state, and you're experiencing things, and you experience the uniqueness of the psychic vision, which is unique to the individual. Maimonides writes this in Prophecy. No two prophets saw visions in the same way. Well, what do you know? No two rabbis see halakha and the Talmud and everything else in the same way. Gee whiz! What a curious coincidence. But the intellect must be cultivated and sharpened like a fine blade so that you can cut through and, as we say, mabdil ben kodesh l'chol, separate between the sacred and the profane. Know the difference between good and evil in the tree of knowledge so that you can finally taste of the fruit of the tree of life. So you see, Hacham adif min navi. A true sage knows and understands this, and he has that little inkling of that Ruah HaKodesh. But there are those out there today who are open, psychic, who sometimes can't handle the influx. It confuses them, and it breaks down the walls of clarity in the mind, leading to a mental illness of such, where which you can't tell and distinguish between, if you will, the sacred and the profane, or the real and the unreal, or the physical and the spiritual. Today we might call this psychosis or schizophrenia. Those are the mentally ill. And that influx into many of these individuals is because of the psychic spiritual experience. And unless they learn how to cultivate and deal with their own inner stuff, this will come back and be, of course, trouble. And thank God we have the abilities that we have today to address these issues. But anyway, moving down through everything. Those who are spiritually inclined always sought to make sure that the development of halakha was built upon the foundations of this psychic intuitive awareness, this Ruah HaKodesh. And that is why rabbis spend their lives studying Torah. Now, think about it. When you're studying, it's not like you're memorizing by rote more information. That doesn't make you a sage. But the more you are absorbed into it, it surrounds you, it permeates you, it fills you. And as that occurs, you become full of Torah. Are you familiar with what I'm getting at? The Christians understood this very well. John, in his gospel, when he said about his teacher Yeshu, and the word of God became flesh and dwelt among us. The word of God, of course, is the Torah. Christians misunderstood this to think it was exclusively applied to one individual, their Yeshu. But we rabbis understood the original Jewish understanding of this and recognized that it applies to every child of Torah, Ben Torah, who absorbs the Torah to such a point that they become a living, walking, and breathing living Torah. That's the secret of what we're speaking about here. These rabbis have the wisdom and the ability because of their involvement in things. Now, why is this important to emphasize today? And the answer is because you have so many people today who call themselves rabbi, who, in all due respect, don't deserve that title. When I studied for my rabbinic credentials way back when in the 80s in Yerushalayim, I had to study the Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries that it was built upon, the Beit Yosef, the Tur, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and I had to know my stuff. And when I went to take my oral exams, right, the rabbi would say to me, take the book, close it, quote it to me. Quote it. I can tell you what it's about. That's not good enough. Quote to me the words. Prove to me that you know it. Yeah. That was how tough the tests were. Right? They were tough. But that proved that we had learned the material and that we could analyze it. Not only repeat by rote, but discuss it. When I sat and discussed with my rabbi issues, he would say, okay, the book says this, but what do you do with that? And he was testing to see if you had chokhmah, wisdom, that intuitive, that you can take the intellect and merge it together. That is what we call a smicha. And there are two levels. When you study the first two sections of the Code of Jewish Law, or Achaim and Yoradeya, you have what's called a Yoreh Smicha. And then when you study and are tested and verified on the second two sections, which deal with the laws of women and the laws of money, then you become what's called a rabbinic judge or a dayan, and that's called a yadin ordination. Some people do it together and they get a yoreh, yadin. Some people just do the first, some people do both. That, in my opinion, the opinion of my peers, is the only true and authentic definition of a rabbi. Not all these people out there today who teach publicly, who read books and blah, 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 and the public opinion and the like. Now, if you are continuing in the Masorah, the chain of continuity, the evolution of Torah, then that is what an authentic rabbi is today. Not like all these people out there. You go into social media today, oh my gosh, I can't blame people for being so confused. I see every opinion under the sun. Everybody's calling themselves a rabbi who have no business using that title. Now, at the risk of sounding controversial here, you have women today who are actually studying, and no woman in halakha can serve in the function of a pulpit rabbi for different reasons I'm not going to get into right now. But does that mean that a woman cannot study and be equal equivalent to a man? I think only a fool would think that. You got brilliant women out there, right? Talmudic scholars and the like. No, they cannot serve in certain functions for halachic reasons. That does not deter them from learning, from growing. And I would encourage women, my rabbi peers are going to get very angry at me for this. While you may not serve as a pulpit rabbi, guess what? You can definitely be a teacher if you want of Talmud. Ladies, if you feel so inclined to become a Talmudic scholar, do so. And go write a commentary on the Gemara. Publish it under a man's name. No one will know the difference. And believe me, you'll be respected with the highest of all the rabbinic peers without any of the nonsensical prejudice. That any woman could do. Remember, we had women prophets. We've had women sages throughout the centuries, too. Just, you should know. But I don't want to sound here like so many of these others who are violating the principles of halakha and blurring the lines, the sacred lines of distinction between male and female. But with that being said, and halakha being very clear on these issues, it doesn't mean that we want to hold people back. Now, let's take that outside of Judaism. What about non-Jewish people? Today, because of the proliferation of Jewish literature, thousands of people, millions maybe, around the world are really getting turned on to it. Wow, this is cool. Here at our KosherTorah school, I'm honored and proud to serve the needs of any and all the peoples in these communities. Period. You're always, always welcome. I'll welcome anybody. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you are. But what you come here, you're going to learn is going to be authentic, kosher, Orthodox Judaism. Thus our name, KosherTorah. Sierra, sweetie, you head there. Why are you eating so many snacks tonight? Why are you so hungry? There you go. We're running out of snacks here, sweetie. Like I said, responsibility. Anyway, you know, all the classes, she's never been like this before. Compliment to what we're talking about. The non-Jew, there are those of, in my opinion, very prejudicial attitude, and I condemn that, who think that a non-Jew is somehow less than a Jew. Baloney. You read Maimonides. There's no such distinction. There's a distinction between Jew and Gentile with regards to obligation and responsibility, but not with regards to spiritual levels. The teaching in the name of Eliyahu Navi. Yeah, that's pretty authoritative. In the famous work called Tana Devei Eliyahu, Eliyahu chapter 9, for those who want to look it up. Eliyahu Navi proclaims to the heavens and the earth, be it a non-Jew or a Jew, man or a woman, free or a slave, everyone can receive this Ruah HaKodesh, depending on what they do. So, you have many people today who are attracted to Judaism. Well, there is and there isn't. There is Torah and then there's Judaism, like I said at the beginning. Torah, the universal principles, the spiritual concepts thereof. Anybody and everybody should have access to these things. Recognize the importance of the intuitive and the rational. Merge them together to become an independent, intelligent, responsible human being. But there are those people who want to say, I want to embrace the observance of Torah laws in accordance to the opinions and ways of the rabbis. Well, you're welcome to do so. If you are a non-Jew and you wish to do so, well, no one's going to stop you. No one's going to put a gun to your head. But if you feel so inclined to live like that, then obviously you really should consider converting to Torah Judaism and living a Torah life, because that's what you're supposed to do if that's what you feel so inclined. But then there are those people who say, well, there are ways and means I want to observe or identify with Israel. Well, if you want to identify with Israel and Jews, by all means. But as a non-Jew, you do not have the responsibility or the obligation of following the rabbis or interpreting and expressing the laws of Torah within that context. So, if you wish to do so, by all means, the doors for conversion are open. But if not, then it's pretty much what and where you want to be. And I don't want non-Jewish people to think that to be an Orthodox Jew living by the Torah and the commandments is such a higher level than where you're at right now. And you're going to get closer to God if you live this way, and it's the only right way of Torah. Well, you know something? Remember Talmud Eliyahu? Even a non-Jew can receive Ruah HaKodesh, can become a prophet even. All based upon what one does. So obviously, everybody in the world should have the intelligence, the intuition, to know the proper right way of living and live with moral, righteous responsibility. It would be, in my opinion, immoral of me to ignore a little doggy who knows no better than to say, I'm hungry, feed me. She can't go and get food by herself. I have to give it to her. If she comes here, and for those of you who watch the class, you know she doesn't do this. If she comes here over and over, there's a reason for that. We have a responsibility to see, to intuit, to know and understand. So again, don't think that that's a distraction. Don't you get all upset. You recognize that there's ways and a need for things, and we have to live accordingly. So, when it comes to how to observe the law, if you are a Jew, you have the obligation and responsibility to live in accordance to the Torah, in accordance to the interpretations and ways of our sages. And of course, you have all kinds of contradictory voices today, just like we've had throughout the centuries. If everybody's saying, no, not like this, like that. And bottom line is this: morals, values, righteousness, these are the appropriate foundations which continue the Masorah. Torah Judaism today very much embraces emphatically ideas, opinions, and practices which in the modern social arena are considered anathema. They're considered the opposite. And they're considered racist and sexist, all this other kinds of stuff, where they've actually clouded, confused the minds of people. Okay? All I can tell you is you're going to believe and think the way you want to believe and think, and that is just the way it is. But if you're going to observe the Torah path and you want to call yourself faithful to Torah, then you're going to do what the Torah says. Or you're just not being faithful to Torah, and you really shouldn't use that term to describe yourself. Don't call yourself a rabbi if you're teaching something that the Torah says, teaching something is permitted that the Torah says is forbidden. That's dishonest. It's disrespectful. And really shouldn't be done. And that is our comment on things. Yes, dear. Look, this is the last one, right? I'm almost done with class tonight, and this is the last of the snacks. Here you go, dear. Last one. You ate the whole bag. All right? And I'll go get you some food later. Like I say, responsibilities. And I think that is so important, and she's a lesson. When we as rabbis have responsibilities, you got to rise up to the occasion. When halakha makes a demand of us, and you say, Nishma, I'm going to learn it, I'm going to understand it, I'm going to analyze it. No. First, na'aseh. First, have that prophetic, intuitive, psychic awareness which tells you, and then you expand it into intellectual understanding. That was the evolutionary progressive growth. Don't forget the na'aseh if you focus on nishma. Because when people do that, they go astray. And that can never, ever be tolerated. So this is the secret of revelation, authority, where we are today, and what we need to do. And I hope and pray that you take this stuff seriously. Learn from my little girl, my little canine daughter. She is so simple, so pure. All she knows is something simple. And we, as human beings, we're so complicated. We're doing this, we're doing. Focus on your needs. Focus on your responsibilities. Do what is necessary to be done. I'm going to conclude on one word, one thing. Many of you might be familiar with the very famous commandment of tzitzit, the commandment to observe wearing the talit. I got a beautiful new talit katan from Eretz Yisrael, and I got it intentionally to wear on the outside. Now, for those who are familiar with the law of the tzitzit, it states you shall look upon them, or ritem oto. There are those who interpret that it says if you look upon them, that means you should wear them by day, because you don't wear them at night. Why? Because at night you can't see. It's one interpretation. Others say that when you wear the garment of the talit katan is meant to be worn on the outside, so as to literally fulfill the commandment, and you shall look upon them. There are those, again, like everything else, different opinions. Some will wear the entire garment on the outside. I do that because right now it's very warm, very hot. So rather than wear it on the inside, I decided to wear it on the outside. It's much cooler. Okay, very practical. There are those who follow a Kabbalistic tradition. According to the Ariel, he says that you have the greater lights, the lesser lights, all of which are reflected within the tzitzit, the patil techelet. Now, my patil techelet here, right? I follow the old Rambam tradition of the 13 chuliot with the patil techelet. So I observe. It's the old Zoharic way and the Maimonides way. Surprisingly, it's all the same. Lovely talit came from Eretz Yisrael, Baruch Hashem. And according to the Arizal, if you're wearing what we call this talit katan, the small one, being that it corresponds to the lower lights, it's supposed to be concealed, like the lower lights are meant to be concealed. And therefore, according to the Kabbalistic teachings, many in the Sephardic community will wear their talit katan under their garment, and with the tzitzit tucked in, completely concealed, according to the Kabbalah. However, you have other traditions, from the Hasidic traditions, that say no, wear it on the outside, proudly and boldly, and they wear it on top of their garments. And then you have others, or other traditions who say, let's combine. Let's put the garment underneath the shirt, but take the tzitzit and wear them out. And in the yeshiva world, you find that that's a very common practice today. Now, I practice the Kabbalah. But when we have the law in accordance to the Kabbalah, remember, the Kabbalah is not the law, according to most. Those say that it is. Most say it's not. If you wish to observe the law according to the Kabbalah, by all means, go ahead. You have plenty of Kabbalistic codes of law. Ben Ish Chai, the Kabbalah will tell you exactly how to do that. But then there are others, like Rabbi Yosef, the Mishnah Brura, Ashkenazi Sfardi, that say something else. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim Chaim, like I taught you earlier. You can have opposing, even contradictory views, which are all in Ruah HaKodesh. So here I am, as the Kabbalist. And for the most part, I will always wear my talit katan on the inside with my tzitzit tucked in. But tonight, I'm wearing it on the outside with my tzitzit out. That's contradictory. No, it's not. Elu ve'elu. And I can choose how to observe based upon the needs of the time and the moment. And for those who don't know how to do that, well, that's why you go to an appropriate, authoritative, kosher rabbi. And you ask for his psak. Question, how do I observe? What do I do in this case? And when there is a question of halakha, that's why you go to an authoritative, kosher, bona fide, ordained rabbi who is a living Torah, absorbed with the words of the Gemara and halakha and the words of our sages. And not all of these adulterated types who learn just so little, sometimes in translation and nothing more, and learn all kinds of different foreign philosophies and ideas and beliefs in different philosophies and religions. Then you're not full of Torah. Sorry. And those are not the ones that we should be turning to. Does that mean that they have no wisdom? Sure, they have plenty of wisdom. They're probably a bunch of nice men and women. All right? Get along with them. Welcome to study here as well. But what they're going to get here is not the heart sutras of the Buddhist tradition. I'm not going to teach you the Samkhya traditions of Patanjali sutras. I am not going to teach you Quran. I am not going to teach you the Christian Bible, other than as it's necessary within a Jewish context. I'm going to teach you Torah. I'm going to teach you mitzvot. And we're going to learn here the proper way. And that is what kosher Torah should be and what you should seek in a rabbi. This is the continuity, the evolution, the growth from biblical Judaism to Rabbinic Judaism. No contradiction, a maturation. Yep, I was once a baby. You might believe that or not. And now I'm an old man. Yeah, believe that or not. But it's still me. It's the same Torah. From the old to the new. Alrighty, enough. I've gone over time. Ezrat Hashem, hopefully we get that message across. Teach this, let people know. Alright? Everybody's welcome. But you gotta do it right. Do the right thing. Always. God bless. Ariel Tzadok, Kosher Torah School. Check out our courses and everything else online. If you're watching this on YouTube, blah, blah, blah. What is it? You're supposed to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, all that business stuff. Go fund me for her. Pay for her snacks. Yeah. All right, but okay, she's done. All right. She played her role. Maybe something was guiding her. Remember, everything comes from Hashem. Even Sierra and her hunger. Think about it. God bless. See you all soon. Shalom.